Afternoon. I'm Sir Peter Gluckman, President of the International Science Council, based in New Zealand, where I head the Centre for Informed Futures, and I'm also Chief Scientific Officer of the Singapore Institute of Clinical Sciences. Over the next hour, we have a panel discussion, an important panel discussion, on the question of has scientific research really changed? Is it really changing? Clearly, what defines science has not changed. It has several key characteristics of being a systematized body of knowledge based on robust evidence and subject only to rational and evidence-informed explanations, and subject to continuous testing and revision. Those characteristics have not really changed since its fundamentals were defined by Bacon, Newton, and Boyle. They've remained the same, although they've been reinforced over time. But science's position in society has clearly changed, and its criticality to society is clearly demonstrated both by COVID and by climate change. And the question is, does that change in relationship to society have impact on the way science is done? At the same time, scientists have changed, technologies have changed science dramatically. Dan Sarabitz, one of the most prominent science philosophers of our time, would argue that technological developments are central to how science has changed. For example, would the questions that Venki or Stefan have been, or Aaron, been able to address been possible without technological changes? But at the same time, science has driven those technological changes, as in the case of Stefan Hell. Yet others would respond that technology is not the driver, rather it's intellectual thought that evolves. Think of Charles Darwin or Alfred Russel Wallace, who changed biology fundamentally through thinking and observation, not through technology. Of course, both arguments are correct, but the question for today is, has the nature of scientific research itself changed in the lifetime of those who are on this call? And will it change, or how will it change into the future? And to answer that question, we have three distinguished Nobel laureates who, like me, are all of a certain age. And to respond to that, I've asked a much younger academic and distinguished scientist in her own right, Yvonne Gao, to respond. I'm not going to spend time introducing our three Nobel laureates. Venki Ramakrishnan, who's a good friend of mine, who got his prize for the remarkable work he and his colleagues did on the ribosome, or Aaron Ciechanover for his work on ubiquitin, a question which I remember struggling with when I was a young postdoctoral student so long ago, or Stefan Hell, who's made such a difference to what we can do using microscopic techniques. Rather, I want to use this valuable time to ask them for their views. So let me start by asking each of our three Nobel laureates to reflect very briefly on, do you think the nature and the conduct of scientific research has changed over your careers? Venki, do you want to start?
Well, I think when I started, it was not uncommon for senior scientists to be working by themselves in the lab with very small groups. And what has happened now is there has been more of a sort of explosion of science, and it's resulted in greater collaboration. Science has become more internationalized. We talked about technology, but I think the computer and the internet are having a different kind of transformation of science than, say, having a better spectrophotometer or even a better microscope. What they're doing is they're enabling information to be shared at breathtaking speed. I remember when I was growing up in India, it would take 6 weeks for a journal to show up, often by surface mail. You were not really in contact. You couldn't really communicate with authors of papers very easily, and so on. Now there's a huge leveling effect that information is almost freely available to all parts of the world. And what that's resulted is it's resulted in the growth of science in areas that were not so advanced only 50 or 60 years ago. For example, the remarkable growth of Asian science is a phenomenon we've all witnessed in the last few decades. And I think it will change. Of course, as you pointed out, science is universal. The laws of gravity are the same in China or in Alaska, but the nature of the questions that people ask will be both culturally and politically influenced. What do you consider important to study? And I think that's going to have a healthy effect on science. There'll be a diversity of priorities and ideas. At the same time, the internet also creates a bandwagon effect. So there are these conflicting forces. You have the opportunity for diversity, but you might actually, because everybody's in contact all the time, everybody follows the same fad. So I find it hard to predict where it'll go, just as we could not have predicted the effect that social media would have had. Nobody predicted the way social media would evolve 20 years ago. So I think it's hard to predict how science is going to pan out in the future.
Thanks, Venki. Aaron, do you want to pick this conversation up?
Yeah, of course, I agree with Venki about the changes, but I regard the changes mostly technological. I think that the principle has not changed. Just to bring an example, technology and intellectual drive have always been linked together, kind of a cogwheel. Think about the history of DNA. It was initially discovery of the DNA as the genetic material by McLeod and McAvery. Then, of course, the structure of the DNA. The structure of the DNA led to a technology, which is sequencing. The sequencing led later on, along with computer sciences, to sequencing of the method. I remember myself sequencing a gene on a long gels was crazy. And now to automated one, and then to sequencing of the entire genome, then to discovery of mutations. The mutations led to discovery of another technology, CRISPR, how to correct mutations. So I think the principles have not changed. Technology always advanced questions, questions advanced technology, and so on and so forth. Of course, Venki is right. The technology and the questions have been broadened. Scientists are not working by themselves anymore. You need many experts around you to help you in areas that you are not familiar with. Let's say for me, bioinformatics, imaging, and so on and so forth. But fundamental questions are not going to be solved by technology. Think about the era that we are living nowadays. COVID-19, a virus that has paralyzed the world almost completely. Look at ourselves. As Venki said, this is the new way of traveling. We haven't imagined it 2 years ago. Whether it's better or worse, time will tell. But we haven't solved even the problem of simple, so-called simple infectious diseases. The fact that nowadays we don't have to repeat that every scientist will solve the structure of a protein, but AlphaFold may help us solve the entire structure of the proteome, will not help us understand better or solve faster the problem of antibiotic resistance. We still have to go to the bench and to really probe and dissect the mechanism, and so on and so forth. So the questions will grow, no doubt about it, in dimension. We have better approach to questions that we haven't been able to approach before, like aging, like malignancies, and so on and so forth. But at the end, we may change even our animal models to more sophisticated models or to different models because of resistance to experimentation in animals. But all in all, I think, if you think long term, whether one day we shall be able to replace the human drive behind it, my thinking is, I hope that not.
Thanks, Aaron. Stefan, would you like to comment?
Yeah, I think Aaron and Venki made very good points. I think also the principles have not changed. I agree with Aaron. And of course, one of the principles is that the decisive factor are humans, are the scientists themselves. So that has not changed. I mean, that's very, very important to keep in mind. Have there been changes? Yes. I wouldn't say there was a single change that I would highlight, but there have been a number of small changes that altogether kind of made a substantial difference if I compare it with the way science was done maybe 30 years back when I decided to become a scientist. Now, one thing that changed in my view was the way results are published. So back in the days when I was young, one would look into a certain result and decide to publish it in a journal that is highly specialized and directed towards a certain community. We didn't care much about the impact factor because, of course, it was targeted towards a certain community that would appreciate the result. The internet and the accessibility of results and databases, of course, have made this kind of thinking obsolete. And what has happened instead is that people look into the prestige of the journal. And the prestige of the journal has become a proxy for the quality of the result, which is, of course, not always true. And I think nowadays people very much look into, oh, we have to publish it in a certain journal that is prestigious and so on. And this kind of thinking of proxy of the prestige of the journal for the result is something that, in my view, is kind of overemphasized nowadays. And it wasn't that strong, say, decades back. Then the second thing that, in my view, has happened, and that's something that one could argue about whether this is good or not. I think back in the 90s of the last century, or even earlier, science used to be a calling. So scientists decided to become scientists because of passion, because they liked science, and it was a calling. So they didn't think much about how much do I earn and what career do I make in science. Of course, people were always worried about their careers, but I think this kind of thinking has kind of grown. And nowadays, I know of people who want to become scientists, like others want to become, say, carpenters or something. And as a result of that, science has become more industrialized. The number of scientists has grown, and because it's industrialized, there are so many scientists, you see it more regulated. There's a lot of regulations about how science is done and how it should not be done. And that's also a development that is to some extent deplorable. To some extent it's good because there are more scientists and science is growing more quickly. But the problem with that is that it's more subject to what you call in German Zeitgeist, so the way people think about something in a certain period of time. And there's a risk that science is becoming more politicized, and scientists are appreciated not so much for what they do or what they've discovered, but the way they behave or how they react and this kind of things. And my worry is that we lose characters, real characters in science that are sort of kind of unique and may have their corners, so might not most the pleasant people, but they're highly creative. So that's the thing that has happened, and those guys may have a harder time in the future. That's my take.
Yeah, let me just pick up on a couple of points that each of you have raised. I mean, one of the issues, Venki, that's certainly changed over time is the size of the system dramatically. When I was a young scientist 50 years ago or 45 years ago, you knew everybody in the field because it was a small field. There were a few people in it. Now, there's literally thousands of people. The size of scientific meetings, even quite a specialized nature, have grown quite enormously when we could have meetings. And I think that's a lot harder. It also has meant that the size of funding has not grown in parallel with the size of the system. And so it's a lot more, I think, funding mechanisms are much tighter, more competitive. Many good ideas don't get funded, whereas I think when we were young, there was a lot more robustness in the system, allowing us to be a bit more provocative and less conservative in the way we put proposals forward. I think the other thing that's changed is the nature. I once wrote a paper saying, has science lost its scholarship? When we were young, we would write papers for, as Stefan says, for the journal of record for that discipline with quite a long discussion where we would potentially speculate or hypothesize beyond the data. Now it's become fashionable to have very short discussions, and you get comments from a reviewer saying, don't speculate beyond the data. So there is a sense in which the system has changed, and perhaps one can understand why, for some of the reasons that Stefan talks about, the industrialization of it. But I do wonder if we've lost something. The other thing that's emerged just in the COVID period, and it comes back to the point that somebody raised, is the rise of the preprint. The rise of the non-peer reviewed preprint and the use of as the way of scientific communication. Now, to some extent, one can understand why that would happen in COVID, but it raises some interesting questions about how one distinguishes really reliable science from less reliable science. I don't know whether the people want to reflect any more on those kinds of issues. Venki?
Yeah, so I think part of the problem that Stefan and you have brought up is that there is a sort of pyramid structure to science now. And I don't know how it compares to 50 or 60 years ago, but the fact is that there are very few academic jobs compared to the size of the student body and postdocs. So they're all sort of competing for these few academic jobs. And part of the reason is that the only role models young scientists see are their mentors and their colleagues, which is to say other academics. They don't see all of the other opportunities for scientists, for example, in industry and policy and government, in publishing, writing, all sorts of things. There are huge careers out there, but they're not brought to young people's attention. So they're all scrambling. And that results in their wanting to publish in journals where they think they'll get a leg up. Now, why do they publish in these journals? Why is there this big rush? And it's because nobody's an expert. You talk about science or nature, it's supposed to be a general interest magazine, right? I can tell you, whenever I've published in those journals, I can't understand the paper before mine or the paper after mine, even though they're closely related, okay? And, so it's become highly specialized. So search committees have no idea, is this person's work really good or not, So they use the journal as a proxy, saying, okay, if this peers feel it's worth publishing in Science or Nature or Cell, then it must be good. And so we'll take that for granted. So they're using the journals as a proxy. Now, I don't know what the solution to that is. The other thing about preprints, it's a great idea, but it then means that you have no quality control into what's out there. There's already a huge amount of noise in the system. There's noise through social media. There's all sorts of alternative facts, etc. So who's going to sift through all this noise to, distill what people know is to be sort of, real or at least worth considering further? I think it's a very tricky problem. I don't see good solutions, even though all the academies, including Royal Society, discuss this.
Stefan, do you want to pick this up at all?
Yes, I have a certain view on preprints. I agree with what Venki has said about preprints and the quality. I mean, that's very clear. Quality certainly is a problem with preprints, but the good thing about them is that they define priority. You see, in the past, if you had a big result, you had to worry about which journal to send it to, because you could come from a small community somewhere, say in a corner of a world, you send it to a big journal, no one knows you, and then you're worried that your result doesn't get published because no one knows it, they don't trust your result, and then it gets delayed and they ask for for all kind of controls and so on. But if you send it, say, from Harvard or Stanford or so, it goes through, you get your priority. Now, this has changed. I think this is very good, because now everyone from any corner of the world can publish their result instantly. It's very clear who had the result first, full stop. And then time will tell if the person was wrong or right. It used to be like that anyway. I mean, of course, a peer review sorted out the total nonsense from the rest. But of course, you had wrong peer-reviewed papers as well. And I think peer review still has its role and will play its important role. That's very clear. But the preprint, I think, is a blessing in my view. And of course, one has to be very careful about what's stated in those preprints. They're very clear. We should not be naive about those results. But I think giving priority to the people who had the result first or the ID first is a real blessing.
Aaron? Sorry, Aaron, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, just, the culture of publication is clearly changed dramatically. The introduction of bibliometrics have changed it in a big way. And as Venki mentioned, we are also have become very busy. Stefan mentioned the regulation on science. We are very much busy with all kinds of regulation. I'm spending, 30-40% of my time on animal forms and convincing committees that the experiment is worthwhile and the pain to the animal and so on and so forth. So basically, we don't have time to read, even for candidates that we want to promote. So what we are doing, we are resorting easily to numbers, H factor, number of citations, and we say somebody did the work for us without even understanding what we did. And I can cite, I don't want to go into details, an unbelievable amount of work, fundamental works that have been published in what we call now side journals, just because they were not accepted to the mainstream or to the big prestigious journals. So maybe on the other hand, the preprint culture is also dangerous because it doesn't go any peer review. Anybody can publish anything. And part of it is that people want to protect their property, so they want to be the first. So you're going out, you put it on the archive, and then you say, well, I was the first without any. So what is the optimal way, peer review versus, and there are other biases. People are complaining because now we have the databases about discrimination of women in publishing, about discrimination of minorities in publishing, about priorities given to known scientists, to kind of stars in publishing. So certainly there is a problem in the publishing industry, and we should really think about it. And also the pricing has become intolerable. We are paying, research is being done by the taxpayer money. And the taxpayer doesn't have, not even the taxpayer, even the university scientists don't have access to this unless you are paying, our library, and I'm sure that the libraries of all the institutions are paying thousands and thousands of dollars or euros or pounds every year in order to read what they did. Because the publishers are private organizations. They are money-making organizations. Think about Springer. Think about, some are not, like PNAS or, academies or professional organizations. But the big one, Nature Publishing Group, they have 200 journals. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry. How we allow it to happen? This is our property. This is property of the community. So this is another disadvantage or fallback or something wrong that happened to us.
I once worked a little bit with Ros Yellow, who got the Nobel Prize for discovering radioimmunoassays. And she told me that the paper that she and Sol Burson wrote describing the first radioimmunoassay got rejected 20 times before it got accepted. And the reason was because they kept saying that you could raise an antibody to a protein. And nobody believed at that time in the 1960s that mammals would produce antibodies to a native protein. So it's interesting how dogma can get in the way of important conversation, and nothing's changed in that. On the other hand, anyhow, Yvonne, would you like to come in now and make some comments?
Yeah, absolutely. I think as someone who had to play that game and fight for a position in the academia recently, I think, you raised very many good points. A lot of us are, eager to publish in these high impact journals because that's the criteria that the search committees uses to gauge our caliber as scientists. And I think, it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem, right? Like we can say at one time that on one side, as a community, we can try to steer away from this, but at the same time, for young scientists, it's also quite a lot at risk in terms of careers and future trajectories of our research. So it's a very difficult problem, but I think there are quite a lot of new community efforts that are rising up. For example, a lot of the journals, especially in my field, for example, the American Physics Society journals, they are starting to have open source, more open access articles for readers to have more easy access without paying a premium for subscription. There are also other efforts such as SciRate, where it is preprints that are not peer reviewed, but it provides a platform for fellow researchers to actually discuss and submit informal reviews to these new articles that's being submitted to provide a little bit of a gauge for the rest of the community to see how credible these results are. So I think there are positive changes in the right direction, but there's still quite a lot to be done in terms of publishing career choices. I think one other thing that I would like to note, especially for the audience here, is that just within my short, scientific career compared to all of the other panelists, I've seen this change of young scientists moving away from this mentality that academia is the only path forward if you are doing a PhD. So perhaps at the beginning of my career, that's really one of the only options we all talk about. We would like to go to a university, be a professor one day. But more and more so by the time I graduated, a lot of my peers actually ended up going to industry, policy, and many of them actually went to start their own companies to bring the technologies they build over the career to a level where it can be some sort of product or a technology, or innovation that can be translated into the society. So I think these changes are extremely exciting, and I'm very happy to see that, because it does open up so many opportunities, so many more opportunities for the young scientists going into this field. So they can go into the field because of their passion, right, and not have to worry about getting very limited choices at the end of their journey in terms of career.
Venki, you raised the question in your introductory remarks about computation. And there's no doubt that computation has totally changed the way we can do science. I mean, I don't know. I mean, I remember getting the first electronic calculator. So I no longer had to try and do correlation coefficients with a manual calculator, which was a very time-consuming business all day to get a simple Pearson correlation coefficient. So it's changed what we can do remarkably. And of course, now big data may be changing the way we do science. Do any of you think that big data in itself is changing how we look at questions? The traditional Baconian model of hypothesis to testing, et cetera. Is big data changing that?
Yeah, so I think big data is making possible asking questions that you never could before on the basis of small scale individual experiments. You can see connections, you can generate new hypotheses, and this cannot be done by humans. It's being done essentially almost entirely by computational methods, increasingly by machine learning and artificial intelligence. And I remember Aaron mentioned AlphaFold. Now, AlphaFold is in very early days, and of course, you can't sort of glean mechanisms. But I can tell you, DeepMind has already spun off a company to use machine learning to look at ligand binding, and the impact of ligand binding, which is going to accelerate drug discovery. So, and chemists are now using AI to develop new organic synthetic routes. Okay, I mean, this would have been unheard of, 20 years ago. I see a real potential, but also a problem. And the problem is that currently, as machine learning is applied, you do not know how the algorithms come up with the conclusions and that they do, or the answers that they do. And we need to have some way of connecting what they do to our intellectual framework, where we have a sort of idea of how the world works and physical laws and chemical laws and so on. And how does that connect with this result? So I think, it's going to be interesting times ahead, but it will change the way science is done as well, I think.
Aaron?
Yeah, I want to relate to the big data from the clinical side of view, because I am a physician, and this is a problem, and there is a money issue here. So, for example, I was chairing actually a big project in Israel that aimed at sequencing 100,000 Israelis, men and women, sick and healthy, young and old, coming from different ethnic groups, with the idea of having access for scientists to this. And part of it is also to do kind of reverse medicine, to know how their clinical files look like, whether in one group that is taking a medicine for diabetes, the frequency of prostate cancer is lower or higher, can we make the link, and so on and so forth. The advantage of Israel over many other countries is that the entire population is basically insured in only 2 agencies. So there is potentially access to all the clinical files plus the sequence. We thought we have a gold mine. Nevertheless, we failed colossally. Why? Because the health fund objected to provide the information because they thought that it belonged to them and they can charge money for that, and it's kind of a gold mine. So the issue of sharing of clinical data, big data, sequencing of cancer patients, or just again looking at patients all over the world that get one drug, maybe we can use the drug for another aim to repurposing drug, is blocked by financial interest. And I think that this is really pity, because as Venki mentioned, I'm not talking about protein structure data, but clinical data that can help repurposing drugs, for example, are blocked because of financial interest. And that's really pity.
There's a related issue too, Aaron, which I think comes back to a comment that Stefan made before. I'm also a clinical scientist, Aaron, and I run the very detailed cohorts in Singapore, where in some subjects we have 1 million data points per subject. And of course you need big data approaches there. But the other problem we have in the collaborations is the fight for priority. If the clinicians put all this effort into collecting all that data, and the data goes off to somebody else who does it, and then somebody else runs the AI or the big data systems, who gets the credit? And in this, and I think as science gets more and more multidisciplinary, in some domains it's well understood. So in geology, it's not uncommon to see 100 papers on authors on a paper. In genetics, it's now not become uncommon to see 100 authors on a paper. But in some areas like physiology, it's very unusual to see more than 10 papers on 10 authors on a paper. So these issues of credit, which come back to the issues that young people worry about, are quite real. Stefan?
Yeah, it's a difficult problem. I think even if there are big consortia, usually it's a few people who really take the lead or have taken the lead. And it will be important to find it out. I mean, we've had the situation in high energy physics for quite some time. I mean, there you have papers with, say, 100 or a couple of 100 authors, and still you can identify 2, 3, 4 people who really took the lead, and they had a vision and organized things. Because in the end, I mean, people collaborate only if there is a certain goal, and somebody has to define the goal and has to take the lead. So while I agree that there will be issues with credits, there are solutions to identifying the decisive people.
So when I look in the chat room, and I mean, it's interesting how the young scientists who are listening in here, and we have over 600 people in attendance. Most of the chat is around the publication issue, the credit issue, the promotion issue, the quality of peer review, impact factor, what I call the bibliometric disease, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The issue is, how do we change that system? How do we improve the system? I mean, I think although we have all thrived or survived the peer review process, we also all, I suspect, all been frustrated by it at times. So do any of us, you have any views how the peer review system might evolve? It's a hard question. We've all struggled with it. Venki?
Yeah, I think it's a very difficult question. All of the academies, all of the science organizations pay lip service to the idea that when you judge candidates, you should not look at where the paper was published, you should consider the actual contents of the paper, etc. But as I pointed out, science is highly specialized and siloed. So a review panel has a very limited expertise in judging any particular paper. Unless somebody in that particular field happens to be on the panel, they're not going to be able to judge how good a paper is or how important it is. It takes a huge amount of work. And I think part of the problem is something you alluded to earlier, Peter, which is the amount of funding in academia has not kept up with the size of the community. And the second problem is everybody's fighting for, or used to be, I'm glad to hear from Yvonne that it's less the case now, but everybody seems to be fighting for those few academic jobs at the end of the tunnel. And as long as that doesn't change, you are going to have this problem. So I think the real solution is to make science open up, expose young people to entrepreneurship, to policy studies, to government, to publishing, to all sorts of interesting jobs. Many of those jobs are at least as interesting as academia, I can assure you. And so, you know, if young scientists know that there's a whole world out there, they'll be less worried about, you know, publishing in these few journals to get to the next leg up. I think that's what I think is a solution.
Stefan?
Yeah, I think Venki is right. And I think it's very likely to happen. I'm very optimistic about that. And the reason why I think this will happen is that the time between the discovery and the time it's going to be used in, say, in a certain application, whatever that is, is going to be shorter and shorter and shorter. So in the past, it took maybe 20, 30 years until a discovery was kind of exploited commercially, if you want to call it like this. Now things change very rapidly for many reasons. First of all, information flows more easily. Secondly, there are more scientists and there's more fluctuation. And thirdly, there is industry has realized that science and discovery is a big fool actually for the development. So I think this will happen, Venki. I think this will this sort of interchange between industry and science will happen more often than we saw it in the past. I can see it in my field very, very clearly, but I think you can see it also in other areas.
One thing that's
certainly in physics and computer science and some areas of chemistry, it's been long true that you know people go off into industry and so on.
Well, how many people got Nobel Prizes from Bell Labs a long time ago? I mean, there's been good science done in private sector for decades. So, I mean, one of the things that's not been discussed at all, and I'm interested it hasn't been discussed, we talked about team-based research. One of the things that's also emerged, particularly, and maybe it's fashionable at the moment, is to talk about interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary research and getting people out of disciplinary silos. Now, a lot of that is about the more utilitarian turn, which I think is, Venki referred to the taxpayers wanting return. It's about dealing with climate change, environmental issues, sustainability issues, et cetera, et cetera. It's also important in medical research, very, very important in medical research, and this role of social versus natural sciences and so forth. The issue is, how do we balance these different kinds of research modalities? what some people call basic research, what George Porter, one of Venki's predecessors, called applied and not yet applied research, avoiding the term basic research, but the different kinds of research, but also between disciplinary and interdisciplinary and transdisciplinary activities. Because there has been a shift, I think, in attitude, particularly in many universities in recent times, over the balance between these activities. Any of you want to comment?
Let me say something about it again, because I'm in a medical school and close to the hospital, so the issue of application is coming up daily. In the word applied or translational, the meaning of it is that you apply something basic into something applied or usable or marketable or commercial. The same in translation. What is translation? You are translating one language, which is in our world is the basic science, into another world, which is more, again, commercial, marketable, useful. So I think that what's going on in universities today, especially in Israel, Israel has a unique academic culture because we used to rely a lot on philanthropy for buildings, for equipment. Jews all over the world donated to different purposes, not only academic life. The Philharmonic Orchestra, different organization, philanthropy was kind of our culture, and gradually it's phasing out because of generational change. Holocaust survivors are passing away. I don't want to go into the history of it, and the universities are pushing people physically, I would say, or proactively, to go more into translational applied research, which I think is dangerous, because at the end of the day, the spring of ideas of basic research will dry out, and there will be nothing to translate. So I think we should let people do whatever they are good at. I can think, for example, about our research. We started from a simple question of how proteins are degraded, and all of a sudden it's a multi-billion-dollar industry of drugs that are coming to the market. We didn't mean to do it. We are not involved even in it now, only marginally. But it came out because, I heard a very good statement from Michael Sella, who used to be the president, a very renowned immunologist, who used to be the president of the Weizmann Institute. And he said there is no translational or applied research. There is only good or bad research. And so I think times are changing. I don't know what is the culture now in New Zealand, Australia, Germany, or the UK, and how people are balancing it. But I can tell you that in Israel, I'm now surrounded by a beehive of IP people that are walking into my lab and try to find any idea that might be marketable, commercialized, protect this. If you go to a conference, don't talk about this and don't publish this and don't, it's really, really changing. And I try to really reject all that and to do what I've done for years. But it is changing. And the commercial, again, I talked about commercial interest and money that is involved in big data, and it's also involved in our academic life, unfortunately, and in a big way.
Anybody want to add? Venki, I'm sure want to pick up, and then Yvonne.
Yeah, I want to address the whole question of interdisciplinarity. I mean, Stefan and I think, are both started life as physicists who, worked essentially in cell biology or molecular biology. And but we didn't do it because somebody told us you have to be interdisciplinary. I think what you do is you follow. I work in a lab founded by physicists, Max Perutz and, Francis Crick, and these people were all physicists and changed molecular biology. I think it happened in an organic way. And my view is interdisciplinarity should be encouraged. You should remove the barriers to people talking to each other and collaborating and so on, and not be too siloed. But it's not something you have to force. A lot of good science will come out within a narrow discipline, and some of it will come out by across disciplines. And you need all kinds of science, for the enterprise to thrive. And we should get away from these sort of fads of this thing, this is the way to do science, or that's the way to do science. There is no, prescribed way to do science, I think.
Stefan or Yvonne?
Actually, I just want to add on to that point. I think having this collaborations across disciplines to happen organically is really crucial, because you can't just lock a bunch of scientists up in a room and say, now do interdisciplinary research, right? So I think what's really meaningful is events like this, or conferences where it's broader in scope, where people just end up talking to each other because they find each other's work interesting. There's been some really amazing developments in my field of quantum computing, just because physicists started talking to material scientists, and they realized that we're doing something, there's a better way to do something we've been doing for a long time, and all of a sudden things improve dramatically. So I think it's this kind of conversations that needs to happen, not some, forms or shapes of research that can be forced upon us. And on the other point earlier, basically about the collaboration between industry or the commercial domain and academics, I think it's not all bad. In some fields, in my field, for example, there's actually quite a nice synergy, because the industry solves a very different kind of problem than what we do in academic labs. So for example, we could be building some proof of principle experiments, and they may not be perfect, but the aim is to show that a certain new way of doing things is possible. But then our industry partners could then take that over and start optimizing that to actually make it usable and make it more ideal to be something that's viable as a technology. And that frees us up from thinking about that last digit of, is it a fidelity of 99 or 99.99, and we can just go do something else that's interesting. Well, we can leave the optimization and the engineering to the experts in the industry. So I think they are, organic and good ways for academia and industry to work together. It just has to happen in a way that's rational, that makes sense. A lot of this actually goes back to common sense, right? It's not there's not a prescribed format, as Venki said. It has to make sense. It has to happen organically.
Aaron?
I just want a short comment about the involvement of the industry. It's as Yvonne said, it's very positive. The industry has means that we don't have in the academia. Screening, they can do a lot of things that we cannot do. The only issue that bothers me is the mixing of academia in the industry in the same very physical place. If you have a lab and you have 20 students and some of them are involved in commercial project and they don't talk to the other students, that's bad. So I think that, you should really build a fence. Your industrial activity should be outside the walls of the academia. That's the only thing that I'm asking for. For myself, I'm establishing now a company, and I'm a CTO of another company, but it's completely separated, absolutely, from my own laboratory.
The other thing that I reflect on over my career is, early on, grants were much more generous and less focused than they are now. I think that there's been a lot more focus. You will do precisely this experiment in this precise way, and it's the same thing as peer review, you must define it very tightly. And when I think back at the work that got me recognition, it's all come from the side work I did on the side of the main application, not the actual major thing for which we were funded, but because they were accidental findings, or they were things that we followed our nose on with a little bit of spare money. And I just wonder whether the industry of science, not private sector industry, but the industry that Stefan was talking about, the industrialization of science, has the risk of reducing that level of excitement on serendipity, the ability to follow serendipity, the ability to shift direction without waiting a year and writing a grant, which may struggle because it sounds like an outrageous idea. I once wrote a grant when I was told by the 3 reviewers, this is not fundable because it's not possible to do this experiment, to which we rebutted by showing the preliminary work that it could be done. And so I think there is something in the system which comes back, Venki, I think, to the money mismatch between the size of the field and the money available, which forces people into more conservative thinking in their grant applications. And we need less conservative, not more conservative thinking in our research. I mean, all of you have got recognition because you were not conservative in the way you approached a question. Had you been conservative, you may have been good scientists, but you would not have been great scientists. And I think it's that we need to protect. Venki?
Yeah, I think one consequence of that is people start building bigger and bigger labs because it protects the lab head from fluctuations and funding cycles and so on. I remember in the old days, professors would be happy with one NIH grant or one MRC grant because they knew it was stable and they could just continue tackling the problem that really interested them. And it's also, so it's leading to these disparities where you have successful scientists running huge labs and other people scrambling for money. And I think that's not healthy either. You know.
So in the last few minutes, let's turn the question. Where do you think, we're obviously all focused on a set of related issues around the culture of science. How do you think it might emerge over the lifetime of some of the audience that's watching us? Yvonne, do you want to comment first?
Oh, I think the culture of science, I mean, in my short career so far, it has constantly evolved, but in a way that constantly surprises me as well. I feel like the most important thing is for all of us to keep an open mind and not be afraid to keep exploring and keep experimenting with different ways of doing things, especially of doing science, because that's the one discipline that really requires us to be creative, to be bold, and to be adventurous.
Okay, well, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so I'm going to ask each of you for a punchline. You know, what do you think is the most important things for young scientists to be aware of as they proceed in this very complex ecosystem where no one part of it, universities, funding agencies, governments, the science community, the academies and so forth, actually determines its shape? It's a really complicated ecosystem. What do you think is the punchline for young scientists now? Venki.
I would say, follow your passion and do what you're interested in, because you will never you're not going to, as a scientist, you're not going to end up doing something boring. Even if you leave academia, lots of people find things that are far more interesting actually after they've left academia. So whether you're stay in academics or you go into other areas of science, you'll have an interesting life. So I would say don't, get paralyzed with fear and anxiety when you really should be enjoying doing what you're doing, because, science is ultimately a very interesting life. So that's what I would say.
Stefan?
I fully agree with Venki. I think doing what you're really good at and what you really enjoy is the key, and there's no question about that. And it can be done in different ways. I mean, it can be done in an academic setting for sure, if that works out. It could also be done, say, in an industry setting, and who knows? I mean, there might be other opportunities coming up in the future. Maybe there is philanthropy to some extent that gives money to very young and courageous scientists to think out of the box, and then they can do the thing that they want. I would hope that this happens at some point, and so in a way, I believe the best thing is just to do what you feel that you're really good at.
Yeah.
It appears there is a complete consensus among the three of us. All what we need to do is to convince Yvonne that this is the way to go. When I look back at, when I talk to young scientists, when I look back at my 45 or almost 45 years in science, and people are asking me about my profession, or say I've never had a profession, I always had a hobby, and some university paid me for my hobby. Really, I enjoyed every minute. And I think that people know when they enjoy it, that they are not fighting daily. Of course, we had the same concerns. I'm sure that Stefan and Venki, I had concerns about funding, I had concerns about publication, I had concerns about promotion. We are human beings. We had family, we have to raise families, to travel, postdoc. moving all around the world, but I didn't let any of those be on my way. At the end of the day, I paved my own road, and I enjoyed it immensely. To nowadays, I enjoy every day in the lab as if it has been the first one. And I think that people cannot lie to themselves about this feeling. And I think that in this way, all three of us do agree completely. We just do something that is awfully exciting and enjoyable. True, you know, we are a little bit smart in retrospect because we all received some accolades and recognition, but certainly we have not started our careers and have not lived 30, 40 years until the accolade came in order to get an accolade. This is not the purpose in life.
And I'm already sold. I've already committed to starting a career in academia, and so far it's been 2 years, and I have to say it's been exciting and very enjoyable. It's worth all the effort we put in. So I guess if there's anything I would like to pass on as a younger scientist in this panel is, you know, the skills that we learn really in our scientific career is so useful elsewhere as well. And it's, you know, even if had I not committed to a research career in academia, I believe that there would have been many other ways that I can use these skills I learned in my PhD to do meaningful and exciting work in any other fields. It's just, I felt very empowered to make any choices at that point. And choosing to be academia is really out of something, you know, just like you guys have already said, having a great hobby and getting paid for it is quite a nice thing.
I think on that note, Yvonne, we should wrap up. I would absolutely agree with all of you. I mean, I've enjoyed every bit of my life. Yes, it's frustrations. Yes, there are risks. Yes, the system's never treating you as well as you would like the system to treat you. You always think they should give you more money than they do. They always think your paper shouldn't get rejected the first time round. Those frustrations exist. But at the end of the day, it's a really, if you're not enjoying it, don't do it, because at the end of the day, the frustrations will be there, but the creative juices, the intellectual collegiality, the way we can relate to people, the community of science is a great community to be a member of, whatever part of that community you're a member of. So with that, I want to thank Venki, Stefan, Aaron, and particularly Yvonne for what's been a very splendid and enjoyable conversation. And I hope we've addressed indirectly many of the questions in the Q&A. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.